There's a silent battle fought in the quiet corners of this world, a war waged not with steel but with belief. It happens in garages after midnight, in dusty workshops when the rest of the world is asleep. It's the fight of a man who sees something others can't, who hears a melody no one else can hum. And more often than not, he's told he's crazy, that his vision is nothing but smoke and mirrors, a fool's errand leading nowhere but ruin. He's the one who bets his last dollar on a hunch, who pours his sweat and soul into an idea that's scoffed at, ridiculed, or just plain ignored. The world, it loves to tell you what's impossible, what's sensible, what's safe. But sometimes, just sometimes, the man who throws sensible out the window, the one who stares down the impossible with a stubborn glint in his eye, he's the one who ends up rewriting the rulebook, turning the world on its head. This isn't a story about luck. It's about a conviction so deep it became a second skin, a stubbornness that blossomed into revolution. It's about the kind of risk that makes your gut clench, the kind of leap that feels like falling until suddenly you're flying. Marcus wasn't flying. Not yet. At 48 years old, his wings felt more like lead weights, heavy with the grime and wear of a life spent mostly on his feet, mostly with a torch in his hand. He was the kind of man you'd pass on the street and forget 5 minutes later, unless you happened to notice the way he carried himself, a certain solidity, like an old oak that had weathered 100 storms. His hands, calloused and thick, looked like they were forged in the very fires he commanded. Each knuckle was a knot of scar tissue, each palm etched with lines that told a story of countless hours gripping metal, grinding seams, and coaxing sparks into submission. They were hands that knew honest work, hands that built, repaired, and held steady under immense heat and pressure. The kind of hands that could fix anything, or if you weren't careful, maybe break it too. His face, perpetually smudged with fine metal dust, was a roadmap of a hard-lived life. Deep lines fanned out from the corners of his eyes, not entirely from smiles, but from years of squinting through a welding mask, of focusing on a singular point with unwavering, almost obsessive intensity. His eyes themselves, when you could catch them out from under the brim of a cap or through the arc glow, held a quiet, observant intensity like a hawk watching a distant horizon. There was a weariness there, sure, a deep-seated fatigue that had settled in over decades. But beneath that, flickering like the last embers of a campfire, was a sharp, almost hungry intelligence. Most folks, though, they just saw a gruff, maybe even a little stubborn man. A reliable hand, yes, a man who showed up, put in the hours, and didn't complain much. A good welder, sure, but not much more than that. The air in the cavernous welding shop hung heavy with the acrid tang of ozone and burnt metal. A symphony of grinding wheels, hissing torches, and the rhythmic clang of hammer on steel. Marcus moved through it all with the practiced economy of a man who had been doing the same dance for decades. Today he was wrestling with a thick plate of high-grade steel, coaxing a perfect bead along its length, the bright blue arc of his TIG torch spitting defiance, then melting into submission under his steady hand. Each pass was precise, each movement deliberate, a quiet testament to a skill honed over thousands of hours. He wasn't just laying down a perfect weld. He was lost in the rhythm, his mind churning beneath the surface, a deeper current flowing unnoticed by the men around him. They saw a welder, a good one, a solid earner, his face illuminated by the brilliant, dangerous light. They saw the quiet competence, the unwavering focus. They didn't see the relentless gears turning behind those tired but sharp eyes, the blueprint of a different world slowly forming, piece by impossible piece in the silence of his own head. They didn't see the dreamer battling doubts, the engineer hidden within the blue-collar shell. Marcus was a man of few words, preferring the honest communication of sparks and molten metal to the often empty chatter of men. When he did speak, it was usually brief, to the point, and devoid of unnecessary embellishment. This often made him seem unapproachable, even a little cold. His colleagues often mistook his quietness for indifference, his focus for lack of imagination. But beneath that gruff exterior was a mind perpetually engaged, observing, analyzing, dreaming, always dreaming of something just out of reach, something everyone else said couldn't be done. He was wrestling with a thick plate of high-grade steel, coaxing a perfect bead along its length, the bright blue arc of his TIG torch spitting defiance, then melting into submission under his steady hand. Each pass was precise, each movement deliberate, a quiet testament to a skill honed over thousands of hours. He wasn't just laying down a perfect weld. He was lost in the rhythm, his mind churning beneath the surface, a deeper current flowing unnoticed by the men around him. They saw a welder, a good one, a solid earner, his face illuminated by the brilliant, dangerous light. They saw the quiet competence, the unwavering focus. They didn't see the relentless gears turning behind those tired but sharp eyes, the blueprint of a different world slowly forming, piece by impossible piece, in the silence of his own head. They didn't see the dreamer battling doubts, the engineer hidden within the blue-collar shell. Marcus was a man of few words. Marcus was a man of few words and fewer wasted movements. Every day was a mirror image of the last. The alarm clock, a chipped, yellowed relic, screamed at 5 a.m. He'd slap it into silence, then swing his legs out of bed, the floorboards groaning a familiar protest. Coffee was a ritual, strong and black, brewed in a pot older than most of his coworkers. He'd eat his stale toast standing up, staring out at the gray pre-dawn light filtering into his small kitchen. His house, a modest, aging structure in a working-class neighborhood, was more workshop than home. The garage, a detached cinder block box behind it, truly was the heart of his existence. The main house, too, was steadily being colonized. Engineering books lay stacked on the coffee table, next to a half-disassembled circuit board. Schematics were tacked to the fridge, vying for space with a faded grocery list. Every surface seemed to hold some piece of his grand, impossible puzzle. The air itself in his garage workshop hummed with the ghosts of failed experiments and the silent promise of breakthroughs yet to come. This was where he lived, truly. This was where the real Marcus, the relentless visionary Marcus, wrestled with the elements, trying to bend them to his will. He knew what they said. He wasn't deaf. Wasting his potential was the kindest remark. Others used words like delusional, stubborn fool, or just a dismissive shake of the head. His colleagues, good men, decent men, mostly just avoided eye contact when his hobby came up. They saw the bags under his eyes, the grease perpetually under his fingernails, and they mistook it for exhaustion from the daily grind, not from the second shift he pulled every single night, chasing a dream no one else could see. But Marcus, he just kept his head down, kept working. Because what he saw, what he knew, was different. He saw a lattice structure, a molecular bond, a strength that defied current understanding. He envisioned an alloy that was lighter, stronger, and cheaper to produce than anything on the market. An alloy that could change industries, save lives, build a future. They called it impossible. He called it Tuesday night's project. The tipping point didn't come with a bang, but with a slow, grinding whisper that echoed the financial strain in his life. It started subtly enough. A routine repair bill for his old pickup, usually a minor headache, felt like a punch to the gut. Then came the unexpected property tax hike, a letter that lay on his kitchen counter for days, its red print a constant, mocking reminder. His meticulously balanced budget, which already accounted for every spare dime going into his research, was now firmly in the red. Found himself choosing between a new set of welding tips for the job site and a crucial raw material sample for his lab. The choice was agonizing, a physical ache. Then came Frank. Frank was the union boss, a burly man with a booming laugh and an opinion on everything. He wasn't malicious, just conventional. Marcus was packing up his gear one Friday afternoon, the smell of ozone still clinging to his clothes, when Frank clapped him on the shoulder, a gesture meant to be friendly. "Hey, Marcus," Frank grunted, his voice loud enough for a few other guys nearby to hear. "Heard you're still playing chemist in your garage. That pipe dream of yours gonna pay the bills, or you gonna stick around here and make an honest living?" The words hung in the air, light as dust, but to Marcus they hit like a hammer blow. It wasn't just the insult or the public dismissal of his life's work. It was the condescension, the assumption that he was just playing. Wasting time, distracting himself from the real work. It was the echo of every doubt he'd ever battled, every scoff, every pitying glance. And right then, with the weight of those bills pressing down and the image of his precious, half-finished prototypes flashing in his mind, something inside Marcus snapped. Not loudly, not violently, but with a quiet, irreversible click. He looked at Frank, a long, level gaze that held no anger, only a profound, weary understanding. "It's not a pipe dream, Frank," Marcus said, his voice quiet, almost a whisper, but firm. "It's what I'm meant to do." Frank just chuckled, shaking his head. "All right, Marcus, don't say I didn't warn you when that bank comes calling for your house." He walked away, still chuckling, utterly oblivious to the seismic shift he'd just triggered. That night, Marcus didn't bother with sleep. He sat in his garage, the cold metal of a partially formed alloy prototype cool beneath his fingers. The fluorescent hum of the shop lights was the only sound, cutting through the profound silence of 3 a.m. He stared at the chaotic clutter around him, stacks of research papers, half-eaten energy bars, tools scattered like fallen soldiers. Every single item represented a choice, a sacrifice. He'd poured every spare penny, every waking hour outside of his job, every ounce of his soul into this. He saw the lines on his hands, deeper than they should be for a man of 48, etched by years of heat and grime and relentless work. He felt the ache in his back, a familiar companion. What had he become? A man defined by what he was. Not a husband, not a father, not even truly a part of the world he inhabited. He was the eccentric welder, the quiet dreamer, the one everyone politely tolerated but secretly judged. Frank's words replayed in his head, a cruel, endless loop. Gonna stick around here and make an honest living. An honest living. Was this not honest? Was chasing the impossible, dedicating your entire being to a vision, not honest? Was living a lie, pretending his heart wasn't truly in the spark and grind of someone else's factory floor, more honest? A wave of raw, brutal honesty washed over him, stripping away years of quiet denial. He saw his life laid bare, a meticulously constructed facade. He saw the fear that had kept him tethered, the fear of failing, of being proven wrong, of losing the meager stability he had. He'd been trying to have it both ways, the safe job, the impossible dream. But now, with the bills piling up and the dismissive laughter of men like Frank ringing in his ears, he realized the two paths had diverged completely. He was standing in the middle, bleeding from both sides, losing ground on all fronts. He looked at the small, crude ingot on his workbench, the result of 1,000 failed attempts, the glimmer of what he knew was possible. It was ugly, imperfect, but it held the secret. And for the first time, truly, deeply, Marcus understood. He had nothing left to lose. Everything he had was already on the table, already dismissed, already at risk. The only real risk left was not betting on himself. The only real risk left was not betting on himself. That night, a final notice from the bank fluttered onto his kitchen table, a stark white rectangle amongst the usual bills. It wasn't just a warning, it was a deadline. The payment for the house overdue. The refrigerator had been humming louder than usual for weeks, and just yesterday the old pickup had sputtered its last breath, a wheezing cough followed by an ominous silence. Life, it seemed, was determined to strip him bare, leaving him with nothing but his conviction and the faint metallic tang of desperation. Frank's words, distraction, pipe dream, twisted in his gut, not just an insult now, but a challenge. A gauntlet thrown down by a world that refused to see beyond the grime on his hands or the spark from his torch. They saw a welder, a laborer. They didn't see the equations scrawled on napkins, the molecular structures dancing behind his eyelids. He sat there, the fluorescent kitchen light buzzing above him, casting harsh shadows on the crumpled notice. His hands, usually so steady with a torch, trembled slightly as he picked up his phone. He dialed a number he knew by heart, the one for his union's benefits office. The automated voice droned on about options, about stability, about retirement. Each word felt like a lie. "I want to cash out," he said, his voice surprisingly firm when a human finally answered. The woman on the other end paused, clearly surprised. Cashing out a 401k at 48 wasn't an option people usually explored unless things were dire. He heard the unspoken question in her silence. "All of it," he clarified, his grip tightening on the phone. It was meager years of modest contributions, but it was something, a lifeline or a single heavy stone thrown into an abyss. The process was slow, bureaucratic, each form an affirmation of the immense gamble he was taking. His fingers, calloused and scarred, signed away years of planned security. The next call was to his bank, the one that held the mortgage on his small, cluttered house. He listened to the loan officer, a smooth, professional voice talking about interest rates and collateral. He nodded even though no one could see him, agreeing to terms that in any other scenario would have made his stomach churn with dread. A second mortgage, a high-interest loan against the only truly valuable asset he possessed. His home, a workshop, a sanctuary, now on the line. He didn't tell anyone, not his few acquaintances, not the guys at the shop. The decision felt too heavy, too intimate, too utterly insane to share. But the final, irreversible step couldn't be done in secret. The next morning, his hands, still smelling faintly of metal and acetylene, picked up his phone again. He called the supervisor, a man named Jim who'd seen Marcus every day for 20 years. "Jim," Marcus began, his voice raspy, "I'm putting in my notice." Effective immediately. A stunned silence on the other end. Jim, usually unflappable, stammered, "Marcus, what are you talking about? You got another offer. We can match it, you know." "No," Marcus said, staring out his window at the rising sun, the first faint pink light touching the cracked asphalt of his driveway. "No, I don't. I'm done." He heard Jim sigh, a long, weary sound of a man who'd seen too many good hands walk away for bad reasons. "Marcus, you sure about this? You got something lined up? Health insurance? You know how it is out there." "I'm sure," Marcus repeated, the words feeling like solid bricks being laid, one after another, building a wall between his old life and whatever lay ahead. "Thank you, Jim, for everything." He hung up, the quiet click echoing in the sudden silence of his kitchen. It was done. The bridges were burned. The safety net shredded. He was adrift with nothing but a wild idea and the bare minimum of resources. That night, 3 a.m. found Marcus wide awake in his narrow bed. The house creaked around him, settling like an old man into sleep, but sleep wouldn't come for Marcus. His eyes were wide open, staring at the dimly lit ceiling, where shadows danced from the streetlights filtering through the blinds. The initial adrenaline rush, the defiant surge of making the decision, had worn off. What was left was the cold, hard dread that crawled into his bones like an icy fog. He had traded security for uncertainty, a steady paycheck for a monstrous debt, and the polite dismissal of colleagues for what would surely be the roaring laughter of the entire world if he failed. He thought of the money, the paltry sum from his 401k, the terrifying amount from the loan. It wouldn't last long, weeks, maybe months, if he stretched every penny until it screamed. And then what? Failure wasn't an option. It was a cliff edge he was now standing on, the wind whipping at his face. His mind replayed every dismissive comment, every snide remark, every well-intentioned warning. Impossible, crazy, waste of time. What if they were right? What if, after all these years, all this sacrifice, he was just a deluded fool? The thought was a physical blow, tightening his chest until it was hard to breathe. He had put everything on the table, not just money, but his reputation, his future, his very sense of self-worth. He pictured his small, older house, the one he'd called home for decades, the garage filled with his obsession. It was all collateral now. If this failed, he'd lose it all. He'd be homeless, broke, and the laughingstock of a town that already saw him as an oddity. A grim, hollow laugh escaped him. Frank would have a field day. Tears, hot and sudden, pricked at his eyes. He wasn't crying for himself, not really. He was crying for the weight of the gamble, for the crushing loneliness of standing against the tide, for the raw, terrifying possibility that he might be catastrophically wrong. The silence of the house pressed in on him, amplifying every doubt, every fear. He was utterly, terrifyingly alone in this. And the future, once a distant, hazy concept, now loomed, a vast and terrifying blank canvas demanding his masterpiece or his ruin. He sat there until the pre-dawn grayness bled through the curtains, painting the edges of his worn armchair with a faint, uncertain light. His body felt heavy, hollowed out by the night's despair. But as the sun finally dared to peek over the horizon, something shifted within him. It wasn't a sudden burst of courage or a dramatic revelation that flashed like a welding arc. It was quieter, deeper, a settling in his bones, a heavy, resounding enough of the doubts that chewed at his insides. Enough of the whispers from the outside world that told him he was wasting his life. Enough of the slow, painful bleed of his own potential, suffocated by caution and compromise. He wasn't sure if he could win, not yet, but he knew, with a clarity that chilled him to the bone and simultaneously set his blood on fire, that he could no longer afford to lose by not truly trying. The world might say he was crazy, that his dream was a fool's errand, but his gut, that stubborn, insistent compass he'd ignored for too long, screamed that he was onto something. And for once he decided to listen to it and damn the rest. The next morning, a Tuesday, felt like the first day of the rest of his life, or maybe the beginning of the end. It didn't start with the jarring shriek of the alarm clock, dragging him unwillingly into another day of routine welds and fluorescent lights. He'd woken before it, the silence louder than any bell. He walked past the stained work uniform he wouldn't wear again, past the lunchbox that would stay empty on the counter. The blunt resignation he'd left on Frank's desk yesterday, typed out late at night with trembling fingers, still felt unreal. A paper bridge burned behind him, severing his connection to the stable, predictable world he'd known. There was no going back. Only forward, into the abyss of the unknown, or towards a glory he dared not even whisper aloud. His coffee tasted different that morning, not just bitter, but laced with the sharp, metallic tang of unalterable consequence. He found himself standing in the garage before 8, the familiar space now imbued with a terrifying new significance. It smelled of metal dust, stale coffee from yesterday's forgotten mug, and a ghost of countless hours poured into this space. Now, though, it felt profoundly different. No longer a retreat, a mere hobby sanctuary, but a crucible where his entire future would be forged or shattered. The weight of his gamble, the sheer, audacious scale of what he'd done, pressed down on him like the lid of a coffin, making the air thick and heavy, almost unbreathable. He looked at the stacks of raw materials, carefully sourced and incredibly expensive, the intricate diagrams tacked to the peeling paint of the wall, the custom-built induction furnace taking up half the space, its cold metal surfaces mocking his ambition. This was it. No paycheck coming in 2 weeks. No union benefits to fall back on. Just him, his unwavering vision, and the raw, unyielding physics of the universe that stubbornly refused to bend to his will. Not yet, anyway. His hands, calloused and strong from years of handling molten metal and heavy machinery, felt oddly clumsy, useless. Where did he even begin? The sheer volume of work, the endless permutations of elements he had to test, the painstaking calibration required to achieve what everyone else deemed physically impossible. It threatened to swallow him whole before he'd even truly begun. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, the silence amplifying the frantic drumming of his heart against his ribs. A wave of cold nausea washed over him, a primal dread creeping from his stomach to his throat, hot and sour. "You're insane, Marcus. Just go back. Beg Frank for your job. Tell them you had a breakdown, that it was all a mistake." The voices, the familiar chorus of doubt and societal expectation, were louder than ever, mocking, whispering the brutal truth of his precarious, exposed position. But then he remembered the look in Frank's eyes that day he handed in his notice, not just dismissal, but a kind of pitying triumph that cut Marcus deeper than a sharp arc from his own welder. That look, it wasn't just doubt, it was a verdict. A judgment on his life, his dreams, everything he'd ever quietly believed himself capable of. And Marcus, for all his quiet nature, had never much cared for being judged, especially by a man who'd long ago traded his own spark for a steady pension. He took a deep breath, the stale air of the garage filling his lungs with the scent of old oil and ambition. Clumsy hands, he thought. Not on my watch. He walked over to the workbench, his movements slow and deliberate, a man preparing for a heavy lift. He picked up a piece of his specially prepared elemental powder, feeling its fine grit between his thumb and forefinger. It was a starting point, one microscopic ingredient in a recipe that could either rewrite metallurgy or leave him with nothing but a mountain of debt and a broken dream. The first few days were a blur of meticulous preparation, an almost monastic ritual. He wasn't rushing into anything. He cleaned every piece of equipment, calibrated every sensor, double-checked every wire connection until his eyes blurred from fatigue. This wasn't just about mixing metals. It was about creating a controlled universe in miniature, a laboratory where variables were tamed and the laws of physics could be coaxed, not broken. He knew the theory backwards and forwards, the quantum mechanics, the lattice structures, the interatomic forces. Problem was coaxing it into existence. On day 3, he finally prepared his first real test batch. The induction furnace hummed to life, a low, guttural growl that vibrated through the concrete floor. Sweat beaded on his brow as he carefully loaded the precise measurements of his secret elements into the crucible. He watched the temperature climb, the metals liquefy, swirl, and then coalesce into a single, glowing mass. His breath hitched in his throat. This was it, the moment of truth. He poured the molten mixture into a custom mold, the metal hissing and spitting as it cooled. He waited an agonizing eternity, then used tongs to extract the newly formed ingot. It was dull, gray, unremarkable. His heart hammered. He took it to the hydraulic press, set the parameters, and engaged the mechanism. The press descended slowly with immense force. The crack wasn't loud, but in the silence of the garage it echoed like a gunshot. The ingot, instead of compressing, fractured into several jagged pieces, scattering across the floor with a metallic clang. He stared at the mess, his shoulders slumping. Failure, a clean, undeniable failure. The alloy had been brittle, flawed, nowhere near the strength he needed. He picked up a piece, examined the grainy fracture. It was wrong, all wrong. He spent the rest of that day and the next, sifting through the debris, examining every shattered piece, every tiny shard under a magnifying glass. He reviewed his notes, his calculations, the exact sequence of heating and cooling. Where did he go wrong? The doubt began to gnaw, a relentless parasite in his gut. His hands, usually so steady, trembled slightly as he meticulously documented the failure. By day 7, the loneliness was a tangible thing, a heavy blanket draped over the small workshop. The phone, which he'd mostly ignored, rang. It was an unrecognized number. He let it go to voicemail. A few minutes later, his old colleague, Dave, a good guy, left a message. "Hey, Marcus, heard you. Left. Everything all right? Frank's asking about you. Said your job's still open if you want to talk. Just think about it, buddy." The implication hung heavy in the air. "Come back to your senses, you idiot." He almost called Dave back. His fingers hovered over the keypad. The furnace sat cold and silent, a monument to his folly. The bills were piling up, stark white rectangles on his kitchen table, mocking his dwindling savings account. Every penny he'd scraped together, every hour he'd sacrificed, every dream he'd nursed, now felt like a foolish gamble about to be lost. He could go back. He could admit he was wrong, pick up his tools, and fall back into the predictable rhythm of the union shop, the steady paycheck, the quiet, uneventful life he'd always known. But then he remembered that feeling in his gut, the unwavering certainty he'd felt when he first conceived of this alloy, not just its properties, but its necessity. He remembered the hours spent poring over obscure metallurgy texts, the flashes of insight that had felt like lightning strikes, illuminating a path no one else could see. He hadn't just dreamed it, he had seen it. And that feeling, that deep, almost spiritual conviction, was not something he could just switch off. He closed his eyes, took a ragged breath, and slowly, deliberately put the phone back down. He wasn't wrong, not fundamentally. He just hadn't found the right way yet. Returned to the lab, not with renewed hope, but with a grim, stubborn resolve. He wouldn't quit. Not today, not tomorrow. He knew the initial failure wasn't a dead end, just another wrong turn on a long, uncharted road. He picked up his notebook, flipping past the failed experiment, and started sketching new molecular configurations, new heating curves, new combinations of elements. He was a scientist, an artist, a madman, all rolled into one, utterly alone in his pursuit. The garage light burned late into the night, a single defiant beacon in the working-class dark. He wasn't going back, not until he'd given every last ounce of himself to proving them all wrong, or proving himself right. The difference, he knew, was everything. The garage light burned late into the night, a single defiant beacon in the working-class dark. He wasn't going back, not until he'd given every last ounce of himself to proving them all wrong, or proving himself right. The difference, he knew, was everything. Days bled into weeks. The initial fury that had spurred him on began to temper, replaced by a colder, more methodical persistence. He wasn't just trying to make the alloy anymore. He was trying to understand why it hadn't worked the way he'd envisioned. Each failure wasn't a brick wall, but a signpost pointing away from a dead end. He started noticing things in the microscopic structures of his failed samples that he'd overlooked before: subtle impurities, unexpected crystalline formations. It was like learning a new language, one spoken by atoms and temperatures. One late afternoon, sweat stinging his eyes, he stared at a discarded shard of what was supposed to be his miracle metal. It was brittle, fractured, useless. But something about the way it had broken, a particular fracture pattern, caught his eye. It wasn't the clean snap of a structural failure, nor the slow yield of a malleable material. It was almost cellular. He remembered a lecture from an old, dusty engineering textbook about organic material matrices and how nature builds strength through layered imperfections, not flawless uniformity. An idea sparked, not a grand revelation, but a quiet, almost hesitant whisper in his mind. What if he wasn't trying to eliminate imperfections, but to orchestrate them? He sketched furiously. His welder's hands, usually adept with steel and flame, now danced with a pencil. He theorized a multi-stage cooling process, introducing specific, minute thermal fluctuations at precise moments, designed not to create a uniform structure, but a controlled, almost biological layering of the different elements. It went against every conventional metallurgical teaching, a heresy in the world of material science. Every instinct, every textbook screamed it was wrong, but the stubborn feeling in his gut, the same one that had pulled him from the edge of giving up, told him it was worth a shot. The next few days were a blur of intense, focused work. He modified his furnace, painstakingly calibrated new temperature ramps, and with a tremor of anticipation, initiated the new, counterintuitive cycle. He didn't sleep much. The air in the garage was thick with anticipation, the hum of machinery a constant lullaby. He brewed coffee strong enough to strip paint and existed on the edge of exhaustion, but for the first time in what felt like forever, the crushing weight of despair had begun to lift. There was a fragile, nascent hope blossoming, a sense that he was finally, truly on the scent. Then came the morning, day 27 of his new approach, the final cooling cycle completed. He extracted the sample from the mold. It looked different, smoother somehow, denser. He took it to his makeshift testing station, a crude but effective setup he'd built himself. The hardness test yielded an unprecedented reading. The tensile strength test, usually where all his samples failed spectacularly, didn't. The machine groaned, the needle climbed higher and higher, then higher still, past the maximum calibrated limit. The alloy held, it didn't break. It just held. Marcus stood there, welder's mask pushed up, staring at the intact sample, then at the protesting machine, then back at the sample. His breath hitched. No wild shouts of joy, no triumphant fist pump, just a slow, silent exhale, a release of years of tension, doubt, and relentless struggle. A single, unshed tear pricked the corner of his eye, blurring the pristine surface of the alloy. He wasn't just right, he was impossible. Word, as it always does, began to spread, slowly at first, then like wildfire through the hushed corridors of the materials science world. A quiet, unassuming welder from a working-class neighborhood had done what multi-million-dollar corporate labs, WITH, Chinese letter S, and Nobel laureates couldn't. When the first few engineers and scientists visited Marcus's garage, they came skeptical, almost amused. They left stunned, their faces a mixture of disbelief and awe. The tests they ran confirmed his findings, then exceeded them. The alloy wasn't just strong, it was lighter, more resistant to corrosion, and crucially, incredibly cost-effective to produce once the method was scaled. Marcus was still Marcus, still wore the same work boots, still drank his coffee black. But something in his eyes had changed. The world-weary resignation was gone, replaced by a deep, settled confidence. He didn't boast, he didn't gloat. When industry titans came to him, offering deals, partnerships, trying to pry secrets from him, he simply laid out the facts, demonstrated the alloy, and let the material speak for itself. He was no longer the gruff, eccentric welder. He was the quiet visionary. The man who had taken a bet on himself when the entire damn world told him he was insane. And he had won. Big. He never once looked back at the stable job he'd left behind. The path he'd chosen, the one paved with failures and fueled by a solitary conviction, had finally led him home. The old house in the working-class neighborhood wasn't so old anymore, not really. It had been meticulously restored, a quiet testament to the man who lived within. The garage, however, remained mostly as it was, save for the state-of-the-art ventilation system and a new, almost surgical cleanliness to the workbench. Marcus would often sit out there late in the afternoon, the smell of cooled steel and machine oil a familiar comfort, a silent companion to his thoughts. He wasn't frantically experimenting anymore, wasn't wrestling with the metal, trying to force it to yield its secrets. Now he was just being. The world outside his garage door had changed, though. The knock on his door wasn't for bills anymore, but for consultations, for interviews, for investment proposals. CEOs and government officials, men in suits that cost more than his old pickup truck, would sit awkwardly on his worn kitchen chairs, trying to make small talk over cups of Marcus's black coffee. He listened more than he spoke still. But now, when he did speak, the room went silent. Every word carried the weight of experience, of absolute, undeniable proof. One afternoon, a familiar, portly shadow darkened his garage doorway. It was Frank, his old union boss, looking smaller somehow than Marcus remembered. Frank cleared his throat, shuffled his feet. "Marcus," he started, a hesitant tremor in his voice. "Heard you've done quite all right for yourself." Marcus just nodded, a slight, almost imperceptible tilt of his head. "Listen," Frank continued, wringing his hands. "About what I said back then, the hobby, the pipe dream, look, I was wrong. We all were. Just. Never seen anything like it. You were always a stubborn bastard, but holy hell, Marcus. You really did it." Marcus looked at Frank, a long, steady gaze that held no malice, no triumph, just an honest understanding. "It was never a hobby, Frank," he said, his voice low, steady as the earth. "It was just what I had to do." Frank just nodded, swallowed hard, and after another moment of uncomfortable silence, turned and left. In that quiet moment, Marcus felt it. Not victory, not vindication, but a deep, resonant peace. He thought back to the dark nights, the desperate calculations, the gnawing self-doubt that had kept him company for so long. He remembered the cold fear in his gut when he'd emptied his bank account, the sneers of those who called him a fool. He remembered the sheer, stubborn belief in his own two hands, in the logic he saw in the periodic table, in the whisper of potential he felt within the raw materials. They had called him crazy. They had said it couldn't be done. But he had known what he saw. He had felt it in his bones, seen it in the molten glow of his furnace. And sometimes that's all you've got. Sometimes you gotta bet on yourself, even when the whole damn world tells you you're wrong. You gotta listen to that quiet voice inside, the one that knows something everyone else is too afraid to believe. Because the biggest risks, the ones that strip you bare and make you question everything, they can lead to the biggest changes. Not just in the world, but in yourself. Marcus still drove the same pickup, still wore the same boots, still drank his coffee black. But the weight on his shoulders was gone, replaced by the quiet strength of a man who had walked through fire and forged his own impossible future. He wasn't rich because he was lucky. He was rich because he was brave enough to stand alone. And that, my friend,